In the gray, rain-soaked autumn of 1987, 26-year-old Rowena Finch inherited what most people in Pemberton County, Ontario, would have politely called a problem. What they said behind her back was considerably less charitable. Her grandfather, Alastair Finch, had worked 280 acres of clay-heavy Shield country soil for 41 years. He had grown winter wheat and barley, and, in his later years, a stubborn patch of heritage oats that no grain elevator in the county would buy at a decent price. He had died in March, 2 weeks after the last frost, with his rubber boots still standing by the back door and a cup of cold tea on the kitchen table. He left Rowena the land, the boots, and a chest of water-damaged notebooks that smelled of mildew and pine sap. He left her nothing else, no equipment worth insuring, no savings, and a property tax bill that was already 3 months past due. The men at the feed cooperative in town, their faces the color and texture of weathered fence posts, told her the same thing in different voices. The soil was finished. The county's clay pan had always been difficult. Cold in spring, waterlogged in autumn, prone to compacting into something that resembled pale gray concrete rather than earth. But 40 years of conventional cropping had stripped it further. The organic matter was gone. What remained was a kind of agricultural exhaustion so deep it had become structural. The answer, they agreed, was a serious injection of synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus, a soil amendment package from the co-op, and a line of credit large enough to make a grown person lose sleep. Rowena had driven from Toronto to settle the estate with every intention of listing the property and returning to her job at a landscape architecture firm. She had a small apartment near Christie Pitts, a drafting table covered in plans for condominium courtyards, and a life that fit inside a city in the way lives sometimes do, neatly, efficiently, without much room for anything inconvenient. But then she opened the notebooks. Her grandfather had not been a writer by nature. His handwriting was cramped and angular, the product of a generation that learned penmanship under duress. But he had been, in the truest sense of the word, an observer. The notebooks were full of dates and rainfall figures, and small hand-drawn diagrams that she initially mistook for idle doodling. It took her 4 evenings, sitting at his kitchen table with a kerosene lamp because she hadn't figured out the generator, to understand what she was looking at. He had been watching the beavers. There were 2 beaver ponds on the back 40 of the property, separated from the main fields by a narrow woodlot of trembling aspen and black spruce. Most farmers in the county treated beavers as a nuisance. They flooded access lanes, undermined drainage tiles, and generally conducted their engineering projects in complete indifference to human agricultural schedules. Alastair had, at some point in the late 1970s, stopped fighting them and started watching them instead. The notebooks recorded something remarkable. In the fields immediately downhill from the beaver ponds, where the water table had risen and the drainage patterns had shifted, the soil behaved differently. It was darker. It held moisture longer in a drought and shed it more readily after heavy rain. The wheat that grew in those lower sections, the ones that every other farmer would have written off as too wet, too marginal, consistently outperformed the upper fields that received all the nitrogen and all the attention. On the last page of the 3rd notebook, in handwriting that had grown shakier with age, her grandfather had written a single sentence. The wet ground remembers what the dry ground has forgotten. He had never done anything with this observation. He was too old, too tired, too ground down by decades of thin margins and cold springs, but he had written it down. Rowena stood in the kitchen for a long time after she read that sentence. Then she went outside and walked to the back 40 in the dark. What she did next cost her the city apartment, the drafting job, and nearly every relationship she had built in the previous 8 years. she stayed. The first person to articulate the community's collective bafflement was her nearest neighbor, a man named Mr. Gallagher, who ran a well-managed operation of about 400 acres to the east and who had, by local standards, been something of a mentor to her grandfather in the early years. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had spent his entire life solving agricultural problems with inputs purchased from reliable suppliers, and this made him constitutionally unable to understand what Rowena was proposing. She explained it to him one morning in October, standing at the fence line between their properties, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She was not going to drain the low fields. She was not going to install additional tile drainage to push the Beaver influence water table back to where agronomists said it belonged. Instead, she was going to dig a series of shallow connecting channels. She called them swales, a word she'd learned in landscape school, that would allow the water from the beaver ponds to percolate slowly through the fields rather than rushing off in spring and stagnating in the low spots in summer. She was going to let the beavers do more of what they were already doing. Mr. Gallagher listened to all of this with the patience of a man who has made peace with not understanding everything. When she finished, he took off his cap, scratched his head, and put it back on. "Rowena," he said carefully, "you're proposing to make your fields wetter. Selectively," she said. He looked at the sky for a moment. "Your grandfather," he said finally, "was a good man, unconventional in his later years, but a good man." He paused. "I think you should call the county drainage office before you do anything permanent." He climbed back over the fence and drove his truck away without looking back. The county drainage officer, a Mr. Renault, arrived 3 weeks later. He was younger than Rowena had expected, with a clipboard and a manner that suggested he had delivered bad news to farmers many times before and had developed a professional gentleness for it. He walked the property with her for 2 hours. He tested the soil. He consulted his charts. He was, to his credit, thorough. When they returned to the farmhouse, he sat at the kitchen table and spread out a diagram of the county's drainage grid and explained, with genuine patience, that what Rowena was describing would likely violate 2 separate provincial drainage agreements that her grandfather had signed in 1974. "The legal issue aside," he said, folding his hands on the table in the manner of a man about to deliver the serious part, "I'm concerned about your winter crop viability. If you increase the subsurface moisture in those lower fields through the growing season, you're going to have compaction problems at harvest. Your equipment will sink. You won't be able to get a combine in there." Rowena had thought about this. "I'm not planning to use a combine on the lower fields." Mr. Renault looked up from his papers. "Then what are you planning?" "Hay," she said, "and eventually, once the soil recovers, market garden crops, things that can be harvested by hand or with small equipment." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very gently, "Miss Finch, hay doesn't pay the taxes on 280 acres. "Not immediately," she agreed. He left her with a sheaf of pamphlets about provincial agricultural loan programs and a look on his face that she would later describe to a friend as pity trying very hard to look like neutrality. He filed his report, and she was told, in a letter 2 weeks later, that any modification to the existing drainage pattern would require approval from the County Drainage Tribunal, a process that typically took 14 months. She applied for the approval and began the other part of her plan in the meantime. "Now, I need you to understand something about what Rowena was actually doing, because it would be easy to describe it as eccentric or lucky or the kind of thing that only works in stories. It was none of those things. What her grandfather had observed and what she had understood almost by instinct the moment she read his notebooks was a principle that soil scientists would spend the next 3 decades slowly reclaiming from the margins of agricultural thought. Organic matter in soil is built primarily by microbial activity. Microbes need 3 things to thrive: oxygen, moisture, and food in the form of carbon. A soil that is stripped of organic matter loses its ability to hold either water or air properly. It becomes either waterlogged or bone dry, lurching between extremes, because the sponge-like structure that healthy organic matter provides has been destroyed. The beaver ponds were not just changing the water table. They were doing something more complex. The slow percolation of water through the peat and sediment of a beaver wetland was stripping nitrates and phosphates from agricultural runoff and converting them into forms that soil microbes could use. The water that seeped into her grandfather's lower fields wasn't just wetter water. It was biologically richer water. It was, in the most literal sense, a slow and gentle meal delivered to a starving soil. Her grandfather hadn't known the mechanisms. He had only seen the results. Rowena knew the mechanisms, and she intended to make them work on a larger scale. The first thing she did was stop fighting the beavers. This was more complicated than it sounds, because 3 of her drainage tiles had been partially blocked by a secondary dam the beavers had built sometime in the previous summer. Conventional wisdom said, blow the dam, relay the tile, get on with it. Rowena instead installed a device called a pond leveler, a perforated pipe inserted through the dam that allowed her to control the water level on the upstream side, while letting the beavers keep their structure intact. This cost her $400 and an entire Saturday of lying in cold mud. The second thing she did was begin composting. Not in any small way. She collected every organic material she could source without spending money she didn't have. Spent grain from a brewery in Bracebridge that was delighted to be rid of it. Manure from a dairy operation. 2 concessions over whose owner, a quiet woman named Mrs. Bouchard's cousin, no, a different family entirely, whose name was actually Mr. Arsenault's former employee. She stopped and simply asked around until she found someone willing to trade. She built windrows of compost along the fence lines of the lower fields, turning them through the autumn, with a borrowed tractor and a rented turner. The third thing she did was make an enemy. His name was Mr. Drummond, and he was the regional representative for a large agricultural input company whose Canadian operations were headquartered in Guelph. He was, in the specific way of men who sell certainty for a living, charming and well-informed and absolutely convinced that he was right. He came in November, driving a company truck with a company logo and a trunk full of product brochures that had been designed by people who understood that farmers respond to images of abundant, healthy crops and clear, confident numbers. He had heard, through the network of rural gossip that moves faster than any internet, that the Finch property had changed hands and that the new owner was making decisions that created an opportunity. He found Rowena in the east field, turning compost in the cold. She was wearing her grandfather's canvas work coat and a pair of rubber boots that were 2 sizes too large and had to be worn with 2 pairs of wool socks to stay on. She looked, he later told his colleague, like someone playing at farming. Mr. Drummond was sympathetic. He was always sympathetic. He acknowledged the difficulty of inheriting a depleted farm. He praised her for staying, for trying. He understood, he said, that she had some unconventional ideas, and he respected that. He genuinely did, but the hard truth of commercial agriculture was that time was money, and the window for viable crop production narrowed every year you didn't hit your yields. He could offer her a complete soil restoration package: synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a lime amendment to correct the pH, and a starter package of broadleaf herbicide for the first season. Financing available. He could have an agronomist out within the week to do a full soil assessment, and he would personally guarantee. "Mr. Drummond," Rowena said, without looking up from the compost she was turning, "what is the organic matter content of my grandfather's best field?" He paused. "I don't have that figure in front of me." "I do." She straightened up and looked at him. "It's 1.1%. The provincial baseline for productive shield country soil is around 3.5%. What your package would do is give this soil a temporary nitrogen hit that it can't hold, because the microbial structure to process and retain it has been destroyed. I'd get 1 or 2 seasons of decent yield and then be worse off than I am now, with a debt load I can't service." Mr. Drummond's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "Miss Finch, with respect, soil microbiology is a complex field, and the approach you're describing is slow," she said. "I know. I'm aware of how slow it is. Thank you for coming out." He left the brochures on the hood of his truck. They blew into the ditch before he reached the county road. She was, by the end of that first winter, entirely alone with her decision. Her friends in Toronto had begun to treat her with a careful, slightly distanced consideration. People reserved for someone who has made a choice they cannot understand. A colleague sent a postcard that said, "Very brave," in the cheerful tone of someone who does not expect bravery to succeed. Her mother called every Sunday and asked, with increasing precision, whether she had spoken to a real estate agent yet. The winter was long and gray and cost her more in heating oil than she had budgeted for. She spent the coldest months reading soil science textbooks from the university library in Barrie, agriculture journals from the 1940s and 50s that described farming practices her grandfather's generation had abandoned in the rush toward chemical efficiency, and her grandfather's notebooks again so many times that she began to see his handwriting in her sleep. Let me stop here for a moment. Have you ever committed yourself to something so fully, not because you were certain it would work, but because you believed in some cellular, wordless way that it was right, that the fear of being wrong and the fear of giving up became indistinguishable? That's where Rowena was, in February of 1988, in a farmhouse where the pipes froze twice, and the oldest section of the barn roof had developed a concerning relationship with gravity. She had staked everything on the memory in the soil, on the belief that what had been destroyed could be rebuilt if you gave it enough time and the right conditions. The question she couldn't answer, the one that woke her at 3 in the morning, was whether she had enough of either. Spring came late that year, as springs in central Ontario are wont to do. The County Drainage Tribunal approved her modified water management plan in April. 14 months, as advertised, nearly to the day. She began cutting the swales in May with a rented excavator, working the machine herself after 3 days of instruction that had cost her both money and a significant degree of dignity. She was not a natural with heavy equipment. She flooded one section of the east field twice before she got the gradients right. By mid-June, the lower fields were doing something she hadn't seen in her 2 years on the property. They were green, not the thin, pale green of struggling grass, but a dense, layered green that suggested biological exuberance rather than mere survival. The composted windrows had broken down over the winter and been incorporated into the soil by the freeze-thaw cycle. The slow seep of beaver-influenced water through the new swale network was doing exactly what she had predicted. The earthworms appeared in July. This is not a dramatic event in the way that, say, a tractor fire is dramatic, but Rowena understood exactly what it meant. Earthworms do not colonize dead soil. They are indicators of a biological recovery so fundamental that no agronomist's test captures it as efficiently as turning over a shovelful of earth and seeing something move. She found the first one on a Tuesday morning and stood in the field for a long time, holding it in her palm like a rare coin. Mr. Gallagher saw her from the fence line and walked over. He looked at the worm. He looked at the soil it had come from, darker than anything on his side of the fence by a visible margin. He said, which, for Mr. Gallagher, was a complex utterance. 14 months, Rowena said. He nodded slowly, turned, and walked back to his truck without another word. But the next week he brought her a casserole dish covered in foil, left it on the porch without knocking, and drove away. In Pemberton County in 1989, this constituted a significant shift in the diplomatic climate. The third year was when the numbers started to matter. She had put the lower 30 acres into market vegetables. Potatoes, carrots, heritage, squash varieties that she sold at the Bracebridge Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, and through a small buying arrangement with 2 restaurants in Gravenhurst whose chefs had begun, in that era, to develop an interest in local and unusual produce. She had kept the upper fields in hay and a small oat rotation. The hay she sold, the oats she ground and sold as flour through the same market channels. Her yields were not spectacular, but her costs were a fraction of her neighbors. She was applying no synthetic inputs at all by the third year. The swale system, working in concert with the beaver ponds, was delivering enough biological activity to the lower fields that she was pulling vegetable yields comparable to organically managed soils 10 years older than hers. She was not rich, she was solvent. For the first time since she'd arrived, the tax bill did not make her stomach clench. She sent a soil sample to the University of Guelph Soil Science Lab in the autumn of the third year, packed in a box with no return address, because she wasn't certain she could bear to put her name to expectations. The results came back to her post office box in town 3 weeks later. Organic matter content, 2.3%, up from 1.1. Microbial biomass, significantly elevated above regional baseline. The lab technician had handwritten a note in the margin. Unusual profile for Shield Country agricultural soil. What are you doing out there? She read it twice, standing by the Canada Post counter in town, and then folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket. What followed over the next several years was not a triumphant parade. It was quieter than that and more durable. The drought of 1993 hit Muskoka and the surrounding counties with genuine ferocity. It was the driest growing season in 40 years. Farmers who had maintained conventional chemical programs found their soils behaving in a particular and awful way. The synthetic inputs had, over years of application, reduced the soil's organic matter further, and soil without organic matter cannot hold water. When the rain stopped, the water left. Crops wilted on schedule with the forecast. Rowena's lower fields held. The beaver-influenced water table, regulated now by her leveler system and the swale network, maintained a subsurface moisture reserve that kept her vegetable crops alive through 6 weeks, with almost no rainfall. She didn't flood. She didn't fail. Her potatoes that year were the best she'd grown, their flavor concentrated by the mild water stress in exactly the way heritage varieties respond when they're grown in living soil. She sold out at the market every Saturday from July through October. The farm next door, not Mr. Gallagher's, who was prudent and managed, but the one to the west, a 200-acre property whose owner, Mr. Fenton, had been running on borrowed money and purchased inputs for a decade, came up for sale that November. The bank had called the operating line. Mr. Fenton came to see her himself, hat in his hands, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped arguing with his own situation. He did not ask her to save him. He asked her for a fair price. She paid it with a loan she had carefully arranged 2 years earlier, knowing in the way her grandfather had known things without being able to articulate them, that this moment would arrive. She took possession of his exhausted land in December and spent the winter planning. It was the following spring, 4.5 years after she'd arrived to settle an estate and found herself unable to leave, that Mr. Drummond came back. He was driving the same model of company truck, but it was a newer version and there were more lines around his eyes. The agricultural input business had been, in recent years, subject to pressures it was not accustomed to. Rising production costs, a slow but undeniable shift in consumer preference, and the emergence of a small but credible body of research suggesting that the chemical fertility model was creating long-term soil degradation at a scale that made its own economics questionable. Mr. Drummond had heard these arguments many times. He didn't believe them exactly, but he had learned to account for them. He had also been hearing about Rowena Finch for 3 years. He found her in the New West Field, the former Fenton property, where she was supervising the installation of a second swale network. She looked up when his truck pulled in. Her expression did not change, but it also did not close. He said he owed her an apology. He said it directly, without the framing devices men of his professional type typically employ. She waited without helping him. "I underestimated what you were doing," he said. "I came out here and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought you were grieving and improvising. I've been doing this job for 15 years and I have a way of seeing farms that isn't always..." Another pause. "You were right about the microbial structure. The research that's been coming out of Guelph in the last 2 years basically confirms what you were doing before anyone had a proper framework for it. And your yields in 1993 during the drought, 30% above the county average," she said. "Without irrigation." He nodded. "Without irrigation." He was quiet for a moment. "My company has been developing a biological amendment line, mycorrhizal inoculants, bacterial consortia, that kind of thing. We're trying to find operations that could serve as demonstration farms, places where the soil biology is already established, where we could show clients what a restored system looks like, what's achievable. We'd pay a licensing fee. We'd bring agronomists, agricultural journalists, tours." Rowena looked at him for a moment. The field behind her was already beginning to show the subtle darkening that she had learned to read as the first sign of organic matter returning to abused soil. 2 beavers had moved into the pond at the northwest corner of the new property within 3 weeks of her leaving them alone. She had found their dam with a kind of quiet satisfaction she hadn't expected. "Mr. Drummond," she said, "I understand what you're offering, and I'll be honest with you. I don't doubt that your biological amendment products work, or that they're better than what you were selling me 5 years ago." She paused. "But what I'm doing here doesn't work because of a product. It works because of a system, a relationship between the water and the soil and the animals that are already here and the time I've been willing to give it. The moment you put a price tag on it and bring tour groups through, you change the thing you're trying to show them." He looked at her for a long time. "You can show yourself," she said. "You can walk this property anytime you like and look at the soil profiles and the moisture data and take that back to whoever needs convincing. I'm not interested in licensing anything, but I'm also not interested in keeping it secret." She turned back to the swale she was planning and picked up her survey rod. He stood there for another minute, and then he got in his truck and drove back down the county road. He wrote about her in an industry newsletter the following year, a brief and somewhat cautious piece that nonetheless found its way to 6 university synopses, extension offices, and a small but influential soil working group on regenerative soil management that was beginning to form in Ontario. She didn't know about the article until someone mailed her a copy with a sticky note that said, "This you?" It was. Now let me tell you about the 30 years that came after, because they are the ones that tell you what the early years were building toward. In the decade following the drought of 1993, Rowena expanded the original property twice more. Each time she acquired land that had been driven to the edge of viability by the same combination of chemical dependency and debt. She paid fair prices and she healed what she could heal, in the order that healing happened, which is to say slowly and without announcement. She took on apprentices, a word she preferred to employees or interns because it implied a relationship that ran in both directions. They came from agricultural colleges and from cities and occasionally from other farms, where someone had sent them because they had asked a question that the operation couldn't answer. She taught them the same thing in different forms every year, that the soil was not a growing medium to be managed, but a living system to be understood, that the beavers were not a nuisance, but a collaborator, that the question was never, how do I force this land to produce, but what does this land already know how to do, and how do I help it do more of it? She never married, which the county found variously admirable and puzzling, depending on who you ask. She had, over the years, people in her life who mattered to her in ways that didn't require formalization. And she had the farm, which required everything she had, and returned it with interest. Mr. Gallagher came to see her the year he retired, driving out in his old truck on a Tuesday in September. He walked the property with her for an hour without saying much. The soil in the original lower fields was, by that point, visually unrecognizable from what she had inherited. It was deep and dark and crumbled properly in the hand, the way good earth does, with a smell like the forest floor after rain. She found a nightcrawler near the south swale and showed it to him without comment. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked to see this." "I know," she said. He nodded, and they walked back to the house, and she made tea, and he told her that he had decided to leave his property to a land trust rather than sell it, because he wanted it managed well, and he wanted to know if she'd be willing to advise. She said yes. If you went to that farm today, you would find a woman in her early 60s. Her hair gone the color of birch bark, her hands still carrying the evidence of 40 years of serious work. She walks the swales in the morning the way her grandfather walked the ditch line, not checking exactly, but attending. There is a difference. She is often accompanied by whichever apprentice is in residence that season, and she teaches them the same way her grandfather taught her, without knowing he was teaching her, by walking and pointing, and occasionally writing something down in a notebook. On the desk in the original farmhouse, beside her grandfather's chest of water-dampened journals, there is a newer chest built from cedar by a carpenter in Bracebridge who owed her a favor. It holds 63 notebooks in her own handwriting, data, primarily, moisture readings and organic matter percentages and cover crop performance and beaver activity logs that span 3 decades, but also observations, the particular way the lower fields smell after the first rain of June, the year the great blue heron started using the North Pond, the first time an apprentice walked into a field she'd healed and said, without prompting, that something felt different here, that the ground felt alive. She wrote that one down carefully. She will pass the notebooks to whoever is ready for them. She has not decided yet who that is, but she is watching, the way her grandfather watched, with patience and without hurry. The story of Rowena Finch is in some ways a simple one. The men with the company trucks and the county clipboards looked at a damaged farm and saw a resource management problem, an equation of inputs and outputs waiting to be corrected by the right combination of products and drainage infrastructure. They told her the solution was purchasable if she would only accept the terms of the purchase. Rowena, guided by the cramped and humble handwriting of a man who had never been to university, looked at the same farm and saw a conversation that had been interrupted. She didn't restore the soil. She gave it the conditions to restore itself. She didn't fight the beavers. She asked them to stay. The men called her stubborn. Then they called her lucky. Then, eventually and grudgingly, a few of them stopped calling her anything at all and simply asked how she had done it. The honest answer, the one she gives apprentices in their first week, is the one that sounds the least satisfying and turns out to be the most true. She had listened to what was already there, and she had not stopped listening when the listening got difficult. That was the whole of it. That was everything.